I feel like people like journalists like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, yours truly, all of us who had been, I think, much more reticent about sharing opinions or sort of making cultural issues more personal, have done something similar to what you've been doing, which is to speak out in a way we normally wouldn't have, because this is the issue of our time. I mean, this culture war goes to the very heart of what America is and ought to be, and it requires extraordinary action. You've been very brave. I'm not going to embarrass you by telling everybody what you've done, but I just want them to know that privately, I've seen you help a lot of people who get unfairly targeted, both with your time and with your dollars. And so I've been your big admirer. But I think that you raise a good point about what could be done to stop what's happening with big tech and its censorship. And so before we keep going down the woke line, I'd love to stop and just spend a minute on that January op-ed, which I loved and we covered on this podcast. It was you and Jed Rubenfeld, who was your professor at Yale Law School. He's married to Amy Chua, Tiger Mom, who I love as well. They're getting unfairly targeted right now at Yale. It's BS. But, and she's fighting back, which is awesome to see. But you and he wrote this very powerful op-ed about why Facebook shouldn't be allowed to censor anybody with a conservative viewpoint from Trump on down, why it's not appropriate for Amazon to kick off Parler, why we should be treating them, even though they're private actors and therefore not covered by the First Amendment, which only covers a state actor, why we should be treating them like they are state actors covered by the First Amendment legally and otherwise, which would remove their ability to discriminate based on viewpoint. Can you explain what you wrote?
Yeah, sure. So conventional wisdom definitely says, Megyn, that private actors are free to decide what does and doesn't show up on their websites when they're behaving as private actors. But the essence of what's actually happening today is a little bit different than that. You have private actors working hand in glove with big government to determine what views can and can't be represented. Today is that the party in power, today the Democratic Party, is effectively using a combination of threats and inducements to be able to get private companies to do through the back door what government cannot directly do through the front door under the Constitution, namely to censor political speech directly. And so the party in power says that if you don't take down hate speech and misinformation, as we, the government, define it, then we're going to come after you as private companies. We're going to regulate you. We're going to break you up. We're going to make it aggressive. We're going to make it swift. Almost all of those are exact quotes from congressional hearings over the course of the last year. And then these big tech titans do exactly what government has threatened them to do, when government also wraps around them the inducement, a special shield of immunity, Section 230 immunity, that preempts any state action at the state level against these companies through the private tort system. So that combination of carrots and sticks, the threats and inducements, which now have taken on a new form, even over the course of the last 12 months, Megyn, of direct coordination, willful participation in a joint activity between the government and private companies to be able to censor COVID misinformation as they define it, that creates state action in disguise. And the core case we made in that op-ed, Megyn, was that if it is state action in disguise, then actually the Constitution still applies. It's that simple. It's a relatively technical argument, draws on a lot of Supreme Court precedents in favor of finding state action when the government induces private parties to do something independently. There's a Supreme Court case called Brentwood, which says that there's one of three bases for finding state action in the action of a private company. It could be either threats made by the government or inducements by the government, or as the term I used before, willful participation in a joint activity. Ironically, in the case of big tech censorship today, we have not just one of those conditions, but all three of those conditions where these companies are definitely responsive to threats. They're definitely protected. They're definitely working and coordinating directly with the government. Just listen to Jen Psaki. She boasts about it. So I think that is state action in disguise. And that's the case that we made, is that they ought to be treated as state actors.
Yeah, Jen Psaki out there with that. We know we've given the list of the disinformation dozen to all of the major social media companies and make sure that they get censored. It's like, well, she admitted it. They showed their hand. This is kind of what Trump is alleging in his lawsuit against these companies, saying that he was unfairly booted. He didn't get it exactly right. So I don't know if he's going to have,
but yes,
right?
I think that's the spirit of what he's getting at. I believe, I have reason to believe that he might have drawn from the principles in our op-ed. I actually wrote another op-ed under my sole name a little bit later, I wouldn't say critiquing the Trump lawsuit, but pointing out some of the ways in which it fell short, but the ways in which he still has a path to victory if he actually makes the claims in the right way. And I think that if he does make his claims in the right way, it could be one of the defining cases of our time. 45th president of the United States, silenced. Herbert Hoover once actually said, this is about consolidation in a different industry, the radio and telecommunications industry, where he said that no president should be stopped from being able to communicate to the people by a private actor who sits in between. He is rolling over in his grave. I believe he was the 33rd president. Now the 45th president takes his case to court. I actually think it could be one of the historic cases of our time. The asterisk to that is he actually needs to argue it with discipline in the right way. and to me, the jury's still out on whether he's able to do that. But I think that he has the potential to actually even make the case that Section 230 is unconstitutional as applied to protecting cases, big tech behavior in cases like against him.
And just explain Section 230, because not everybody knows what that is.
Yeah, sure. I apologize. So Section 230 is basically a statute that has two parts. I'm going to focus on the second part of it, what's called 230C2, which effectively says that these companies have no immunity under state law, have no liability under state law for removing content. And here's text from the statute, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. So that's Congress saying there's constitutionally protected material that we can't, as Congress, legislate out, that we, the government, can't ban, but that private companies who take down that content will be immunized in return for doing so. That's what Section 230C2 does. Their vision, Megyn, was actually applying that doctrine to softcore pornography, certain types of pornography that might have been constitutionally protected under the First Amendment that Congress still wanted to deputize these private companies to be unafraid in taking down. Now you have statutes coming up in states like Florida that effectively pass non-discrimination statutes that say that actually social media companies cannot engage in political discrimination online. And what you have is a debate that says that actually Section 230 preempts that law. That is, federal law overrides state law to say that actually the federal law wins when the two are in conflict, that law is now actually on hold. It's being stayed by a district court judge when big tech pushed back and said that Section 230 would preempt that statute. Well, one of the cases I would make is that Section 230 is arguably unconstitutional if it preempts a state statute that reinforces a constitutional right. So those are the kinds of arguments that I think President Trump could take all the way to the Supreme Court. That's under Florida law, but he could make it a part of the claim of the federal case that he's bringing against the big tech titans through supplemental jurisdiction.
It's so great. It's so rich. If you think about what DeSantis and the Floridians did, they sort of made big tech own its bias. It's like, no, you can't discriminate against political viewpoints. And big tech was basically like, well, we want to, and we're allowed to, and we're going to continue to, because we're allowed to, thanks to 230. I mean, that is what they're doing. It's the same thing as your complaint about, what you've seen when it comes to stakeholder capitalism. As long as your bias goes one way, you're fine. The 230 bias that's being executed by these big tech companies is always 90% of the time one way. It stifles the conservative viewpoint, not the other.
It is. And Megyn, if I may for a second, just because it's really topical, a lot of the liberal outrage against the recent Texas abortion law was the fact that it actually deputized private actors to do through the back door, through the civil system, what the government could not directly do under Roe v. Wade as a doctrine. Well, if you're on the left and you find something offensive about that in the case of the Texas anti-abortion statute, then I think that there's no basis for you not to see the same issue in spades with what the government is actually doing with respect to restrictions on free speech. If you think that whatever you think of Roe v. Wade, if you think it was a constitutional right to be able to get an abortion because of I think a poorly decided case, but let's put that to one side. You ought to agree that the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States can't be evaded by the government delegating its dirty work to private actors there either. Yet that's exactly what's happening every day. And so it's actually a tool that could be dangerously used by both sides. I don't think this is a liberal or a conservative issue. We do not want to live in a society where the government is able to sidestep the constitutional constraints by deputizing private mercenaries to do its bidding instead. And whether you're on the left or the right, I think you should see a problem with that.